Hi, folks, and welcome back to The Original Church. Today we're talking about persecution in the early church. Let's get the big myth out of the way first. The early Christians did not hide in the catacombs during times of persecution, in spite of the fact that my favorite sword and sandal films promote this myth. Now, if you've never seen the movies The Robe, Demetrius and the Gladiators, which is the sequel to The Robe, or Quo Vadis, you really need to see these movies. They're all great, but they're not historically accurate. And so, in spite of the fact that they will show people hiding out in the catacombs to avoid the Romans, that didn't really happen. By the way, the thumbnail picture, the image that I use at the beginning of these videos, that's a photo that I took inside one of the catacombs in Rome. That's kind of like what the catacombs look like on the inside. The catacombs are very fascinating, but they were not a hiding place. They were legally registered burial grounds. The Romans knew exactly where they were, and so Christians could not hide out in them even if they wanted to. They did not have regular worship in the catacombs. Now, some of the catacombs did have small chapels built into them for funeral masses. And the early Christians did also celebrate the memorial meals based on the Roman refrigerium. That's the memorial meal to remember the loved ones who have passed on every year on the anniversary of their death. The early Christians did celebrate these memorial meals at the graves of their loved ones. And sometimes that meant above ground, above the catacombs. Sometimes it meant in the catacombs, especially if there was a larger sort of family cubicle carved out in the catacomb. And sometimes, when there was a marble sarcophagus, the lid of the sarcophagus actually served as the table, not only the table for the fellowship meal, but the table for the Eucharist as well. And this is actually the beginning of the tradition where in the most ancient churches, the altar table is also a tomb. Well, the early Christians may have had funeral masses in the catacombs, and they may have had these memorial meals, sometimes with a Eucharist, in the catacombs, but they did not have regular worship in the catacombs. Sometimes they had secret back entrances to the catacombs so that the Romans wouldn't see them coming and going. But again, they would not be able to hide out there during times of persecution if the Romans were looking for them. In fact, just one example to demonstrate the point, in the year 258, the Bishop of Rome, Sixtus II, and several of his deacons were doing a funeral mass in one of the catacombs, and they were arrested. The Romans marched right into the catacomb and arrested them right there in the middle of the funeral mass. Now, versions of the story differ on whether they were murdered right there in the catacomb or whether they were taken out and executed, but they were martyred. Now, this brings us to the bigger question, because some people, even some misguided scholars, have questioned whether there really was much persecution in the time of the early church. Some people are willing to dismiss all of the evidence as pious legend. And don't get me wrong, there is plenty of pious legend that comes out of the early church, but the early Christians really did experience a series of persecutions. It was not constant, but it came in waves, and it was significant, and many Christians died simply because they refused to give up their faith. So what I'm going to do today is run through a quick timeline of the escalation of persecution from the beginning through to the point where Christianity is legalized and the sort of organized persecution ended. Now, when you read the New Testament, you'll see evidence of very early persecution by the religious authorities within Judaism. And in fact, the Apostle Paul was a persecutor before he was an apostle. But that's not what we're talking about today. What we're talking about today is when the government of the Roman Empire was targeting and persecuting Christians for their faith and executing them because they would not give up their faith. You see, as long as the Romans thought that Christianity was simply a sect within Judaism, The church could fly under the radar. Christianity got a pass, same as Judaism, as an ancient religion. And because it was seen as ancient, it was assumed to be harmless. In fact, as late as about 49 or 50 AD, the Emperor Claudius expelled all the Jews from the city of Rome. Now, the reason for this is probably because of some drama going on between Christian Jews and non-Christian Jews. But you see, the Romans didn't really have a sense that there were these two groups within Judaism, and so he got wind of Jews causing trouble and just kicked them all out of Rome. Of course, they didn't all leave, but the point is that at this point, the Roman emperor didn't really see Christianity as something separate from Judaism. But then a couple of things happened. First of all, the Romans started to figure out that Christianity was becoming something separate from Judaism, right? And as soon as it's seen as separate, then it's seen as something new. And if it's new, it's suspicious. The other thing that happened is that there was a war between the Romans and Judea between 66 and 70. The temple was destroyed in the year 70 AD. And then later there'd be another war in the early 2nd century. And so the point is that when there were these wars between the Romans and the Judeans, it became more convenient for the Christians to separate themselves from Judaism in the eyes of the Romans. Now, unfortunately, this plants the seeds of some early anti-Semitism within even some of the documents of the early church. But the point is that at this point, the early Christians started saying, we're not a part of that, we're something different. But in saying we're something different, right, then they became suspicious in the eyes of the Romans. So here's the breakdown of the sort of waves of persecution and the way the persecution escalated over time. It all begins really in the year 64 AD. On July 18th, there was a great fire in the city of Rome. This fire in Rome burned a major section of the city. And it just so happened that the emperor at the time, Nero, had plans on his desk to rebuild that section of the city and build for himself a great golden palace. And so it didn't take very long for people to start blaming Nero for the fire, as if he was clearing land for his new golden house. And in fact, it's probably true that he had the fire set. Well, he needed a scapegoat. And so he blamed the Christians. And so persecution against Christians begins in the year 64 AD under the Emperor Nero. And in fact, it was within the next few years that both St. Paul and then St. Peter were martyred in the city of Rome. The point here, though, is that at this point, Christians are being executed on the charge of arson. So admitting you're a Christian means admitting you're an arsonist and you are responsible for the great fire in the city of Rome. By the way, Christians were not executed in the Colosseum yet because the Colosseum wasn't built yet. The Colosseum would be built later in this part of Rome that had burned to the ground. Now, fast forward a few years to about the year 95. The emperor is Domitian, and a new wave of persecution is brought on the church, and now the persecution that was once pretty much just limited to Rome is now expanded to the provinces. And the other thing that's new is that Christians are no longer charged specifically with the crime of arson. They're not really charged with any specific crime, but charged with sort of the vague crime of atheism. And so it's at this time that the Apostle John is exiled to the island of Patmos and writes the book of Revelation. It's at this time that St. Clement, Bishop of Rome, writes his letter that we know of as First Clement, and then eventually Clement himself is martyred. So you see what's already happened. The persecution that begins in Rome is now expanded to the provinces. The persecution that had begun with a specific crime, arson, is now expanded to a vague charge of atheism. Well, as we come to the turn of the 2nd century, and Trajan is the emperor, we actually have some correspondence, a couple of letters between Trajan and one of his governors, a guy named Pliny. And in those letters, they discuss what to do with Christians. And by this time, we can see that no charge at all is needed. They don't need to be charged with arson or even atheism. Simply the name of Christian is a crime. Admitting you are a Christian is now enough of a crime to basically make you guilty of treason. But, Trajan says, of course these Christians are guilty, but let's not seek them out. If we find out about them, if they admit to being Christians, obviously they should be executed, says Trajan, but let's not go seeking them out. So as of yet now, simply the name of Christian is a crime, but they're not quite yet kicking down doors. And it's during the reign of the Emperor Trajan that Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, is martyred, and he's one of the more famous saints martyred at this time, and he was martyred in the Colosseum. Okay, now fast forward again to the turn of the 3rd century. The emperor is Septimius Severus, and he issues an edict in the year 202. An edict is like an imperial pronouncement, a new law. And he issues this edict, and what's new now is that now at this point, Christians are to be sought out. They're to be looked for. Now the empire is going to start kicking down doors, looking for these Christians. And in the following year, in 203, we have the famous story of the martyrdom of Perpetua and her catechism classmates. And so this explains why they were arrested all together as a catechism class, and they were eventually martyred as well. And for those who don't know, the diary that Perpetua kept during her imprisonment is available for us to read. It's an amazing story, and it's one of the rare times we get something written by a woman in her own voice. So if you haven't read the diary of Perpetua, you should absolutely read that. Now, Severus's son, Caracalla, in the year 212, granted the gift of citizenship, Roman citizenship, to all inhabitants of the empire. Now, that sounds like a good thing, except really that just means they could collect more taxes from more people. But what he did was, and what happens at this point is that they start using pagan sacrifices as a test of loyalty to the emperor and the empire. And this had been done a little bit before, but now it becomes law. You can use the command to participate in a pagan sacrifice as a test of loyalty. And anyone who refuses to make the sacrifice is guilty of disloyalty to the emperor and the empire. And that's treason, and treason is always a capital offense. And so in the middle of the 3rd century, in about the year 250, maybe late 249, the Emperor Decius begins the first organized, systematic persecution across the whole Roman Empire. Everyone in the empire is commanded to demonstrate their loyalty by making or participating in a pagan sacrifice. In every city, a committee is set up, a panel. You have to come forward, line up, make the sacrifice in front of witnesses, and you get a receipt. It's called a libellus, like a little booklet or pamphlet. And you get a receipt, and you can be asked to show this receipt to prove your patriotism, or even to be able to buy and sell in the marketplace. And if that makes you think Revelation chapter 13, there were a lot of people who thought this was the fulfillment of the prediction in the book of Revelation of the mark of the beast. Well, it was during the middle of the 3rd century that the famous Saint Valentine was martyred in Rome, and you know his feast day, February 14th, right? A few years later, the Emperor Valerian escalated the persecution with an edict of his own, which basically just proclaimed that all Christian clergy should be put to death. And within a year of that, 2 popes were martyred, including the one I mentioned, Sixtus II. And then finally, at the turn of the 4th century, we come to what we refer to as the Great Persecution. In the years 303 and 304 AD, the Emperor Diocletian issued edicts that ordered the destruction of church buildings and the arrest and execution of Christian clergy. And that great persecution, the worst of them all, lasted until Christianity was legalized with the Emperor Constantine and the Edict of Milan in the year 313. And so you can see this escalation of persecution over the time from 64 AD all the way to like 312. Not only an escalation of the persecution itself, but an expansion of its scope and an expansion of what it meant to be an antisocial, disloyal person in the empire called a Christian. So, if you read some of these revisionist histories that tell you that there was no persecution, or that it wasn't really that much, or that there weren't that many Christians who died, don't believe it. In fact, the whole 3rd century and the development of the church and the sacraments and the clarification of our sacramental theology that took place in the aftermath of the 3rd century persecutions, none of that can be explained without widespread persecution. Now, the details on that are a topic for another day. But don't believe anyone who tells you that there wasn't persecution in the early church. And if you go to Rome and you go to the Colosseum and the tour guide tells you that Christians never really died in the Colosseum, don't believe that either. Plenty of Christians died in the Colosseum. Not in the year 64 because the Colosseum hadn't been built yet. But after that, for sure, Christians died in the Colosseum and also in the Circus Maximus and also in Piazza Navona and also on the Vatican Hill. So, if you want to think about the struggle that the early Christians went through in these first centuries of the church, remember, always remember, that in order to pass on the faith to us, they faced threats to their very lives, and they faced this choice on a regular basis, loyalty to Caesar or loyalty to Christ, with very, very serious stakes at risk. Well, that's all for today. Thanks for joining me on The Original Church, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers. Hey, thanks for watching this video all the way to the end. I really appreciate that. Please share this video with your friends, and please join me in the Original Church community on locals.com. Don't forget that if you join the Original Church community on locals.com, you can join me each week for a live, in-depth, chronological Bible study. It's live streamed every Saturday, but you can watch it later if you're not available. So join me for that, and I'll see you there. I hope to see you there. I hope to see you there, and I'll see you there.